Well, welcome back, and we're going to talk about the second aspect of evolution today. So we're starting to talk about the mechanisms by which evolution can occur. So in this video, we're going to look at the importance of variation in population that can lead to evolution, outline the 5 stages that lead to natural selection and evolution of a population, and we should be able to define the terms gene flow, mutation, and genetic variation from this. So let's get started. So in our last lesson, we talked about the fact that evolution is the genetic change in characteristics of a species over many generations, which result in the formation of new species. So it's not just a phenotypic change, this is a genetic change. We're talking at the genetic level that eventually the accumulation of these genetic differences results in the formation of a new species. Simply put, this is descent with modification. So of course we're looking at the process of heredity, the inheritance of new traits, and the way that these traits can accumulate differences over time. So of course the first thing before we can have any kind of evolution is we have to have genetic variation. If we were all genetic clones of each other, there would be no mechanism by which new differences would appear in a population. So evolution can't occur without genetic variation. Okay, variation meaning differences in the genotype, differences in the genetic makeup of the organisms and the individuals. So variation or diversity is important in ensuring fitness and survival. These variations occur naturally in a population. There's always genetic variation in a population, and we can see that in our school community, in dogs and cats and various other things. Okay, there's always, things never look exactly the same, and they always have an accumulation of different traits. There are 3 primary sources of genetic variation that we look at. These are mutations at the genetic level, so this is talking about mutations in the DNA of an organism. Gene flow, so this is generally migration or different genes traveling from one place to another. Okay, and then sexual reproduction. There are mechanisms in sexual reproduction that bring about mutation all in themselves with the way that mitosis and meiosis occur. So let's talk about the first one, mutations. Mutations are simply changes in the DNA. So remember we said that we could have a genetic code. This genetic code codes for the different alleles and genes that we see in an organism. We talked about how DNA is replicated, it unwinds, and then we form a second strand of the DNA. So every time this happens, we're making a copy. And things can go wrong, just like when you're copying something out, you might miss a word, or you might replace a different letter, you might have a spelling error. Same thing happens during DNA replication. You can end up with a mismatch, so the wrong nucleotide being put in the place of the original one. So instead of being A, where we should have T coming in here, and then A, and then C, C, G, you might end up, a mutated strand might end up with something that might be A, C, C, G. We might end up with this one here, putting in a slightly wrong base than what should be there, and we call that a mutation. These mutations can either have a small effect or a large effect. A single mutation may end up being what we call a silent mutation, where it's not really detected, but it may also create variation in the population. Okay, these variations may be favorable or unfavorable. If the mutation is unfavorable during the process of natural selection, it will be selected against, i.e. it will be a mutation that makes the organism more susceptible to perhaps dying early or not being able to reproduce, so therefore that mutation won't be passed along. If the mutation is favorable, it may end up being passed along in a greater level than a mutation that was just not favorable or unfavorable. Okay, so mutations are not always favorable and they're not always unfavorable, but if they are, then we see them being selected for differently. Okay, this series of mutation and selection is what leads to evolutionary change, giving an accumulation of many mutations. So a single mutation may not lead to evolutionary change, okay, but the accumulation of many mutations over multiple generations over time can lead to a different distribution of the genotype within the population and eventually a new species. The next one that we need to talk about is gene flow. And gene flow is the movement of genes from one population to the other. If we look at the diagram here, we can have a population of an organism on one side of a mountain range and a population of an organism on the other side of the mountain range, and they will contain different genetic makeups. They may be the same species, but they might have different genetic makeups. So you might have a Western deer population, an Eastern deer population, and at a certain point they find a pass through the mountains, which means, and some of the Western deer move into the Eastern deer territory. If these deer mate with the eastern deer, then their genes become part of the genetic code of that population, and this is what we call gene flow, the movement of genes from one population to another. Okay, so this is the carrying the genes through to a population where they previously did not exist. Okay, this can therefore spark a new variation in the population and therefore be affected on differently by different selection pressures and lead to evolution of the population due to the incorporation of these new genes. The other one is sex. So all humans and mammals and animals undergo sexual reproduction, and we know that meiosis produces new gametes. There is a stage in meiosis that we didn't look at in detail where the chromosomes cross over. So the chromosome from the mother and the chromosome from the father undergo what we call crossover, and they actually swap parts of their DNA and mix it up. This is why you don't look like an exact blend of mum and dad, because there is this crossover that occurs in meiosis which mixes up the genes just a little bit. So you have some things that look like mum, some things that look like dad, and then some things that are distinctly you. Okay, because there's been genetic variation incorporated into the meiosis process of forming the gametes. Okay, so when organisms reproduce sexually, some genetic shuffling occurs, okay, so mixing up of the DNA, okay, mixing up of the DNA, okay, and brings together new combinations of genes and alleles, okay, so we get new combinations being formed during sexual reproduction. Again, because this incorporates difference in our genetic makeup, in our genotypes, it brings in variation into our population, and we cannot have evolution without variation. Okay, so just to review this idea, we've talked about the things that lead to variation in the population today. As soon as we have variation in a population, we have differential reproduction, because some will be more fit than others to survive and reproduce. Okay, so thinking about things like camouflage and the rabbit example we looked at, in a tundra desert environment, the white rabbits are selected against because they're easier for predators to see. So we had variation in the population. Then there is a selection pressure, which we will talk about in our next video, okay, in terms of natural selection, okay. Then there is less of a particular mutation, so it is unable to reproduce as much, so that their genes are not passed on. So in the heredity of the population, the more dominant genotype is passed on, and we see that becoming the dominant genotype and eventually the new species evolving. Okay, so we have variation, selection via natural selection due to fitness, and then the passing on of those traits through generations. Okay, because without the passing on, okay, to the next generation, we're not going to see those mutations altering our population, okay? And they're the steps that we look at in terms of variation and natural selection. In our next video, we will look at natural selection in detail. I'll see you in class.